Hello, friends. Thank you for being with me. Subscribe, like, and let's get started.
The rain poured down in torrents, flooding the narrow streets of the city and turning them into small streams that carried away leaves and small debris. Catherine ran along the sidewalk, clutching her bag to herself, in an attempt to take shelter from the weather. Her umbrella, which had clearly seen better days, resisted the wind and threatened to turn inside out. Damn it, why today? She grumbled to herself, feeling the water seep through the thin soles of her shoes. Her salvation was on the corner. Catherine saw a cozy cafe with a warm light and, without hesitation, pushed open the heavy door and entered it. The warm air, saturated with the aroma of fresh coffee and cinnamon, enveloped her. She stopped in the doorway, brushing raindrops from her hair and looking around for an empty seat. The remnants of the water creaked on her boots as she moved cautiously to the counter. A long line of office workers and students stretched to the barista. Time passed slowly, and Catherine, tired of waiting, began rummaging in her bag, looking for her wallet. At that moment, her elbow brushed against someone's hot cup standing on the edge of the counter. "Oh, I'm sorry. What is it?" she blurted out as the dark liquid splashed down. "It's okay," a calm voice said. Catherine looked up and met the green eyes of the man standing in front of her. He smiled, slightly embarrassed, as if apologizing for the fact that his coffee was poorly positioned. "Are you okay?" "What is it?" he asked, holding out a napkin. Catherine, taken aback by his sudden kindness, nodded, but noticed a dark stain on her blouse. "Oh, that's terrible. Well, what a day." She looked down at her clothes. "Don't worry, it's fixable," the man said, his voice surprisingly soft, as if he was trying to calm the tension in her gestures. His simplicity and benevolence immediately set him apart from the crowd. He was not the type of man Catherine was used to encountering at work or in life, always confident, sharp, as if competing with each other. This man seemed like a calm island amidst the noise and chaos. "Let me buy you some coffee. It looks like your day already requires compensation," he added, smiling a little. "My name is Andrew." He introduced himself when they received their drinks. "Catherine," she replied, feeling the tension gradually drain away. The awkwardness quickly gave way to a conversation that flowed easily and naturally. They found a small table by the window. Catherine found herself thinking that his voice was soothing, and his manner was admired for its sincerity. "Do you always give coffee so generously to strangers?" "What is it?" she asked with a slight smile, wrapping her fingers around the warm glass. "Only when they apologize so sincerely that it's impossible to ignore," he replied, and they both laughed. Andrew turned out to be a man who loved listening more than talking. He asked questions as if he was genuinely interested in her answers, rather than just politely agreeing. He found out that she works in advertising and is always on the run, and she found out that he is an architect who is immersed in the dream of opening his own studio. "An architect? So you like order and symmetry?" she teased. "Rather chaos and ideas that seem impossible." His answer surprised her. The rain outside the window began to subside, but their conversation was not interrupted. Time seemed to slow down, and Catherine felt relaxed for the first time in a long time. When they left the cafe, Andrew offered to walk her to a taxi so she wouldn't get wet again. At parting, he handed her a small paper napkin on which was a phone number and the phrase, "If it rains again, call me." 8 months after their first meeting in that rainy cafe, Catherine stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom. The white lace of her wedding dress caught the sun rays filtering through the curtains. Everything seemed unreal, as if it was happening to someone else and not to her. She nervously smoothed the fabric at her waist, remembering the day she first saw Andrew, his soft smile, and the phone number on the napkin that she had kept until now. On their first dates, Andrew showed Catherine his small office where he worked on the drawings. There was nothing luxurious, but it was cozy, and there were sketches of his projects on the walls. "That's all I want," he said one day, showing her a model of the house he dreamed of building. There was not only confidence in these words, but also something more than just a desire to succeed. Catherine, on the other hand, tried to share her life with him, which was sometimes chaotic and stressful. Andrew never complained when she rescheduled meetings because of work, but he always supported her, even if she felt like she was working too hard. For months later, he invited her to a picnic in the park. It was a warm spring day, and they settled down under a large oak tree, spreading a blanket. Catherine, feeling relaxed, watched as Andrew fiddled with the basket, pulling out sandwiches and an apple pie. "You know," he began, suddenly serious. "When I first saw you in a cafe, I thought, this is the person I would like to live my life with." Catherine froze. Her heart skipped a beat with her. "Andrew," she began, but he interrupted her, pulling a small velvet box out of his pocket. "You've changed my life, Catherine. I want to spend it with you. Will you marry me?" His voice sounded so confident, and she could see the sincerity in his eyes that melted her. She nodded without a second thought, and tears rolled down her cheeks. After 5 years of living together, small changes began imperceptibly. Thanks to Andrew's support, Catherine rose through the ranks faster than she could have imagined, immersing herself in a world where respect was measured by the number of signed contracts and the volume of applause at meetings. Andrew, on the other hand, continued to work in his modest architectural firm. His ambitions have always been moderate. It was important for him not only to build, but also to create comfort, to give people places where they could live happily. However, for Catherine, it gradually began to seem too simple. "Do you really think that at this rate you will ever open your own studio?" "What is it?" she asked one evening, leaning back in her chair after a late dinner. Andrew looked up from his drawings. His calmness, which had previously calmed her, now irritated her. "I have a plan. Not all at once, Kat," he replied, smiling as if trying to ease the tension. "A plan? Andrew, you've been talking about plans for years. Maybe it's time to do something?" Her voice was cold, and her eyes were sharp. Andrew put down his pencil, sighing, but didn't answer. This silence, which had previously seemed to her a sign of his wisdom, was now perceived as weakness. In the following weeks, their conversations became shorter and shorter. Catherine was late at work, coming home tired and annoyed. From time to time, she would find Andrew at the table with another project, and something about his relaxed state would cause her a dull irritation. One day, she entered the apartment, holding in her hands a thin folder with a contract that she had just signed with a new client. Her mood was high. The deal promised the company a huge success, and she, of course, would also be celebrated. "Andrew," she called from the doorway, but there was no answer. She found him in their small living room. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by sheets of paper on which there were drawings. A cup of tea was already cold on the table. "Have you been here all day?" Her voice was louder than she expected. "I was working on a new project. I think I've finally managed to come up with the right design." He looked at her with a slight smile, as if expecting praise. But instead, she just snorted, throwing the folder on the couch. "You've been working on this for months, Andrew. It's not impressive. Do you understand that we can't afford to let your career drag on like this?" Andrew was silent. His eyes, filled with pride for his blueprints, instantly went out. Catherine walked past him, heading for the kitchen, leaving him sitting among the sheets. Tomorrow's to-do list was already spinning in her head, and annoyance at his inaction filled the entire space. However, other cracks soon began to appear. At one of the corporate events, Catherine felt like she was on top of the world. Her colleagues congratulated her on her latest success, and her new client openly admired her skills. When she looked back to share a moment with Andrew, she noticed that he was standing alone in the corner, holding a glass of champagne. He didn't like these events, but he always attended them out of great love for Catherine. His posture was calm, but uncertainty was evident in every movement. He seemed like a stranger in this world. When he finally approached her, Catherine noticed that he was trying to keep up her conversation with the guests, but his words sounded too modest. "Maybe you'd better tell us about your new project?" She said it with a hint, but her tone was closer to sarcasm. Andrew looked at her as if trying to figure out if she really wanted to hear this. "It's still in the process. I don't want to get ahead of myself," he replied, clearly avoiding discussion. "Of course," Catherine said, raising her glass to her lips. "We're used to the process, aren't we?" These words silenced him. He nodded, and that was the end of their conversation at the party. Later, when they returned home, Andrew tried to start conversation. "Do you really think I'm not trying hard enough?" Wearily, Catherine took off her shoes, leaving them by the door. Andrew, it's not about trying. It's about the results. And there are none. Is that all you see? Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, and she was about to respond, but instead she shrugged and went into the bedroom. Andrew remained standing in the hallway with his head down. The cracks in their relationship were getting deeper, and every conversation they had, every awkward pause or harsh word, distanced them from each other even more. At the next corporate event of Catherine's company, Catherine felt like a queen, standing in the center of this sparkling world. She was wearing the elegant dress she had been choosing for the past week. It accentuated her figure, but left plenty of room for imagination. A thin train gently glided across the floor, and massive earrings added sparkle to her look. She was laughing, holding a glass of champagne in her hands, and a small group of colleagues and clients gathered around her. "You're absolutely glowing today, Catherine," one of her colleagues, Marcia, exclaimed, nodding at her necklace. "Thank you," Catherine replied with a slight smile, as if compliments were commonplace to her. But deep down, she enjoyed every word. She was the center of attention. It was her space, her element. Every conversation is like a game for the public. Every laugh is a confirmation of its importance. Andrew wasn't jealous. No, he was too sensible for that. But at that moment, he felt that an invisible wall was forming between him and Catherine. Catherine, meanwhile, was too engrossed in the game to notice him. One of the colleagues, Rick, leaned slightly towards her, whispering something. She laughed, throwing her head back to show how much she enjoyed his attention. "You and your husband are such a beautiful couple," he said, and his words, although they sounded like a compliment, for some reason caused her inner discomfort. "Thank you," she replied shortly, sipping her champagne. At that moment, she glanced sideways and saw Andrew. His gaze met hers, and for a split second, something pulled her toward him. But he didn't come over. He just nodded and turned away. "Catherine, tell me, how did you manage to get that client from London?" Marcia's colleague distracted her, and everything started spinning again. She told stories, joked, and her laughter sounded louder than it needed to be, but she didn't notice it. It was her night. The hall was buzzing with laughter and lively conversations. Champagne flowed freely. Waiters scurried between the tables with trays, and the guests were animatedly discussing work, travel, and the latest gossip. Catherine was the center of attention. A group of colleagues and clients gathered around her, hanging on every word. She loved those moments. Confidence overwhelmed her, filling her with an energy that surpassed even the best wine. Andrew was on the sidelines. He was standing against the wall with a glass of red wine, watching her. His gaze was gentle, but there was weariness in it. His smile, although present, seemed strained. Catherine didn't notice him. She laughed with her colleagues, doing everything to keep up the mood. The conversation turned to a family topic. Who is married to whom? Who has children? Who is planning a vacation? Husbands always think they're in charge, but we know who really controls everything. One of the women remarked with a smile, and the group burst into laughter. "I absolutely agree," Catherine chimed in, raising her glass of champagne. "Sometimes it seems that men still live in the illusion that their dreams and plans mean something." Her voice sounded a little louder than it needed to be above the general noise. A few people laughed, but it was an awkward laugh. Catherine continued. "Take my husband, for example. He is so passionate about his projects that he doesn't even notice how the world is moving forward." The words came out of her mouth before she could think them through. She noticed a short pause around her, as if someone had pressed the pause button in their animated conversation. And then she saw Andrew. He was standing not too far away, clearly having heard her words. His face froze, as if she had thrown something heavy at him. Her laughter stopped. Andrew took a step forward. The guests, as if sensing the tension, began to turn away, pretending that nothing had happened. "Catherine, can I talk to you for a minute?" His voice was flat, but there was steel in it. She nodded, setting her glass on the nearest table, and followed him. They went out into a small corridor outside the main hall. "What was that?" His voice was low, but it made it sound even sharper. "It's just a joke, Andrew. You know how it is at such events." She tried to smile, but her smile faded under his hard gaze. "A joke," he repeated. A note of bitterness appeared in his voice. You call that a joke? Are you saying in front of everyone that my dreams don't mean anything? Andrew, I didn't mean anything bad. You're taking everything too seriously. Maybe because what I'm doing is really important to me. He looked at her with pain in his eyes. And for you, it's a reason to laugh. Catherine opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck. It was the first time she had seen him like this. He had always been calm, balanced, but now his voice was trembling and there was fire in his eyes. I always thought you believed in me, Kat, he continued. But every time you prove the opposite. It's not like that. Her voice was quieter. I was trying. Tried what? Do you want to show yourself better at my expense? Pretend that you're taller than me? He paused, then nodded slowly. I'm sick of. Those words hit her like a thunderbolt. What do you mean? What is it? She asked, feeling her confidence melt away. He looked at her long and hard. I've had enough. I can no longer live in the shadow of your ambitions. Hear your jabs and pretend that everything is fine. Her heart sank. After Andrew uttered his harsh words, there was an agonizing pause. Catherine stood in the hallway of the hall, trying to collect her thoughts. He turned away from her and headed for the wardrobe, clearly intending to leave the party. Andrew, wait. Her voice was shaking, but she hurried after him. We can't just leave. Do you really want to make a scene? He stopped at the wardrobe counter and glanced at her. What about that scene you made? His voice was low, but there was pain in it. I can't ignore this anymore, Kat. Catherine looked at him, feeling panic rising inside her. She couldn't let it end like this here in front of everyone. Okay, she finally said, trying to stay calm. We'll talk at home. Andrew said nothing, picked up his coat, and left the room without looking back. She hurried after him, feeling the curious stares of the guests on her. When they entered the apartment, the tension that had been building up between them all evening seemed to fill the entire space. Andrew carefully hung his coat on a hook, and Catherine took off her coat and threw it on a nearby chair without bothering to hang it up. Her thoughts boiled like superheated water. She followed Andrew into the living room, kicking off her shoes at the entrance. Her breathing was heavy and her thoughts were confused. The words he said at the party and his departure continued to ring in her ears. We need to talk, she said abruptly, entering the room. Andrew stood at the window, looking out at the night city. The light of the lanterns reflected on the glass, but his face remained in shadow. I think we've said enough. His voice was flat, almost devoid of emotion, which annoyed her even more. Andrew, you just left. You embarrassed me there in front of everyone. How could you? Her voice grew louder, and she crossed her arms over her chest, trying to contain her indignation. He turned to her, his face still calm, but his eyes were tired. How could you say such things? His words were short but sharp. In front of everyone. It was a joke. Stop it, she shouted, taking a step towards him. A joke. Andrew sighed, but his voice rose. Kat, you don't even realize how often your jokes make me the subject of ridicule. You're laughing at me like I'm some kind of loser. It's not fair. I wasn't trying to humiliate you, she retorted, feeling her own emotions take over. Really? Then why do I feel that way every time? He took a step toward her, his voice firmer. Why do you always make me look weak? Why do you always pretend that my job is just a hobby? She opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off, silencing her. You don't even notice, Kat, he continued, looking her straight in the eye. You're so passionate about yourself, your career, and your success that I've stopped being a part of your life. That's not true, she whispered, her voice trembling. His tone remained calm, but his words were like knives. You can't see me, Kat. You only see your expectations, your ambitions. And if I don't match them, you make a mockery of it. I'm trying. Stop it, she shouted, her voice breaking. I'm trying for both of us. For our future. What is the future? His question was quiet, but there was strength in it. We don't even talk to each other. When was the last time we just sat together, without your phone, without talking about work? She paused, realizing that she couldn't remember. Andrew, her voice softened, and she took a step toward him. We can fix this. He shook his head, avoiding her gaze. You say that every time we fight, he said, and everything stays the same every time. I can change. She grabbed his hand, her eyes glistening with tears. He looked at her hand, then at her. It's not just you, Kat, he said softly. It's in us. We are no longer the people we were when we met. Don't you dare say that. Her voice cracked, and tears began to run down her cheeks. I still love you. Andrew looked away. Maybe you do, he whispered, but I don't feel that love anymore. Those words hit her like a bolt from the blue. She let go of his hand, taking a step back. Are you telling me that you don't love me? Her voice was barely audible. He closed his eyes as if he was gathering his courage. I'm tired, Kat. I'm tired of not being enough. I'm tired of you looking at me as a disappointment. I'm tired of us hurting each other. She froze, feeling her world crumble. What do you want to do? She whispered. He looked into her eyes, his face expressing only sadness. I think we should break up. Those words hung in the air like a bolt of lightning. She couldn't believe that he had actually said that. No, it's not. Andrew, no. We can fix this. She took a step toward him, her hands shaking. Please give us a chance. He shook his head, backing away. Kat, I gave us everything I could. I can't take it anymore. He turned and headed for the door. You can't just leave, she screamed, but her voice sounded weak, almost pleading. He stopped at the threshold, turned around for a moment, and said, I'm already gone, Kat. I just didn't admit it until today. The door closed behind him with a thud. Catherine remained standing in silence. Her arms dropped and her legs buckled, and she sank to the floor. The world around her ceased to exist. The apartment enveloped her in silence, so deaf, so absolute, that she seemed almost alive. Catherine was sitting on the living room floor, leaning against the cold wall, staring at the door through which Andrew had left a few minutes ago. His words continued to echo in her head, which did not subside. I'm already gone, Kat. Those words were sharp and left a wound in her heart. She got up slowly, as if in a daze, and went into the bedroom. His things were still in their places. His shirts were neatly hung in the closet, and his favorite book was on the bedside table. It looked like he could come back at any minute. But she knew he wasn't coming back. Catherine sat down on the bed. Her gaze fell on the photograph on the dresser. In the picture, she and Andrew were laughing, hugging each other against the backdrop of a seascape. She remembered that day. They were walking along the beach, holding each other's hands, talking about future plans. I remembered how easy it was to love him back then. Tears began to flow, but she didn't try to stop them. Her shoulders were shaking with sobs, and the air seemed to become thick like water that she couldn't breathe enough of. Later, when the tears had dried up, Catherine moved to the kitchen table. The usual chaos lay around her. Empty cups, forgotten documents, a box with a half-eaten pizza. She stared out the window, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the night. She was remembering the first acquaintance, his warm smile when he handed her a napkin in that cafe, the way he talked to her like she was the only person in the world. His calmness and kindness were her salvation back then. Their wedding, a small but loving ceremony. She remembered the way he looked at her as she walked down the aisle. There was nothing but pure, sincere love in his eyes. Their first years together, how they sat on the balcony in the evenings, discussing everything from his dream of opening an architectural studio to her ambitions in work. They were partners, allies. But then, like a shadow, a change came. She saw how her success at work began to overwhelm everything else. How she brought home tension, irritation, and discontent. How her words became sharper and her remarks more painful. She remembered how he looked at her when she was talking to him, and how his gaze gradually lost its warmth. You can't see me anymore, Kat. Her fingers curled into fists, and she forced herself to stand up. She started walking around the apartment, picking up his things. Her hands were shaking as she picked up his favorite book. She opened it, and an old movie ticket fell out. They were watching a movie together, and she vaguely remembered him holding her hand back then, whispering something funny. She was sorting through his things, as if she was looking for answers. Every shirt, every pair of socks, every object reminded her of his presence, which was now gone. Later, unable to stand the loneliness, she went outside. The city seemed as lively as ever, but to her, everything was devoid of color. She walked, not knowing where she was going, until she found herself in front of the very cafe where they had met. Catherine stopped at the door. The lights were dim inside, and several couples were sitting at tables, talking in low voices. She didn't enter, just stood outside, feeling her heart constrict. She remembered how he had offered her coffee back then. I remembered his smile when he said, "If it rains again, call me." She took out her phone, opened her contact list, and found his name. His number was still in the first place. Her finger hovered over the call button. She wanted to hear his voice, to tell him that she still loved him, that she was ready to change, that she was ready to start anew. But she didn't press it. Catherine put her phone in her pocket. She knew that he had left not only the apartment, but also her life. She knew it was too late now. She didn't notice how it started to rain. Drops dripped down the cafe windows. People ran past with umbrellas, hiding from the weather, but it did not move. Silence surrounded her again. This time, even in the noise of the city. She was surrounded only by rain and reminded of the day it all started. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.